My name is Kevin Baird, and we are today going to be talking about modern learning environments and especially standards to help us scale those environments. I'm going to be drawing from some different research. One of the most important pieces of research is research that talks about how classroom ecosystems are literally, the environment is never neutral. And those ecosystems actually can increase student learning by upwards of 20%. But how do we do that at scale? What does that look like? I always like to give away some things. So Sebastian Sanchez, Sebastian is actually here in the background. S. Sanchez at meteoreducation.com is a person to connect with, and also myself, Kevin at edcenter.org. We have a rubric that we can share with you. There's a white paper. And actually, I'm going to show you some different kinds of classroom analyses and some curriculum analyses. And Meteor Education actually funds that at no cost to you if you wanted to do some of that. Okay. So let's begin. I know some of the folks who are joining us today don't know much about Meteor, so I want to give a little sense of Meteor. And I think it will make sense then why we're talking about standards for learning, also standards for the environment. Meteor Education partners with educators to design learning environments and then to plan them literally from day one, to make a plan to scale, to deliver them, install them, and support them. Meteor represents more than 200 manufacturers, actually the largest manufacturing network for schools in the United States, in North America. So if you think about it, if you took a schoolhouse and you turned it upside down, kind of anything that fell out of the schoolhouse, Meteor helps to design and put together and fulfill. Meteor partners with Dell Computer and Technology, the nonprofit Center for College and Career Readiness for curriculum and training, and the University of Southern California Rossier School of Education for graduate training for leaders. At the core of the environment, everything really begins with what we call design meld, and that's where interior design meets instructional design. So today I'm going to be talking about elements that are both interior, they're both about kind of the hardscape of the building, but also impacting what's happening in instruction. And if you think about how that comes together, those things speak into different kinds of environments in different ways, but it's absolutely critical. And I would suggest if you don't understand how absolutely important it is to have an educator working with an instructional designer, the interior designer, I want you to consider the stools that just showed up on your screen. Because I once walked into a classroom and there were a ton of these little stools, and they were actually all up on the top of the bookcases in the classroom. And I asked the teacher, what's with the stools? And essentially, the teacher had come into the classroom. It had been a brand new classroom, and the stools were what were provided for the teacher and for the students. And in this particular classroom, which had younger students who actually had issues with classroom management and with some behavioral issues, they just didn't work. So you increase expense and you created a learning environment that simply was not appropriate for the real world. So we want to make sure in our standards that we're creating a high impact learning environment. Meteor looks at the entire school, and I'm going to give you a sense of how these standards impact different kinds of environments. So this is the picture on your screen is an active, engaged classroom design. And what actually happened here is that this school district, actually Sarasota, Florida, they began with curriculum design and actually asking what their curriculum and their vision for instruction was going to be, especially in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and especially to increase participation rates amongst certain students, including their young women. And from there, they actually then designed their learning environment, and they had the desks made, custom made. And that's one of the things that Meteor does. So we think about this as literally you have your instructional folks coming together with your interior design folks. And in this case, they were coming together with a manufacturer to create customized materials, customized desks and chairs. We do a lot of work in cafeterias and cafes, but not just to create kind of a funky looking space to eat your lunch. Well, we focus on how to increase food service or lunch program participation with students. And our primary consultant there, Kern Halls, he actually comes from Walt Disney World, and he has a record of increasing lunchroom program participation upwards of 40 and 50%. But again, you're thinking about standards, not just for what's going into that space, but how you're using that space and promoting that space. Our work in media centers is aligned to the findings and the standards of the American Association of School Librarians. As a matter of fact, many of our consultants that work in our media centers are speakers and authors with AASL. And then there are a lot of specialized spaces that we might think about. For instance, we partner with Dell Computer on esports, and this is an example of an esports gallery. A lot of outdoor spaces, some very interesting standards there. By the way, construction and environmental standards, as well as learning standards. And we've even partnered with Coach David Bascom from the Baltimore Blast to think about standards for leadership development in some of those outdoor spaces. The approach is something that we call total project management. Now, it's true that we provide kind of a view into the standards for design and what's happening in the project in a piece of software called total project management. But here's the thing I really want you to understand by way of introduction today. We have literally studied failure in projects. We're the largest provider of learning environments in schools in the US. We know what goes wrong. 75% of projects fail because of missed deadlines. 37% of projects fail because of an inability to meet specific requirements. And that's where we came to understand standards for scaling high impact learning environments. Here are 14 standards. Most folks will readily get and say, oh, we do that. The first set of standards under the word criteria. Price, selection, looking for multi-year, thinking about I need to have interior design, I want to have my teachers voicing into it, etc. But here's what we found. If I have price as a part of my criteria, but I don't have as part of my criteria or standard a multi-year agreement explicitly for refreshing my environments. Because literally, you know, the day after things are installed, I might need a new caster, or I have something that needs to be replaced or needs to be added on to. Your vision, your investment in design starts moving into chaos. And it's not just having a multi-year agreement, it's about a strategy for refreshing and scaling. You get a dilution of your design vision if you don't have that. And by the way, everything ends up being more expensive. Most folks have a specific kind of selection as a criteria, but if you don't have instructional vision as a part of that selection, you have what I like to think of as colorful chaos, or as a purchasing director in one of the largest districts in California talks about, you end up having teachers coming in and moving into different zip codes because there's no actually coherent instructional vision into what kind of environment they're walking into. I might have a plan for multi-year investment, but if I don't have pilot classrooms, actually beginning from day one, thinking about how I'm going to pilot a new design idea in a school and a plan for equity. One, I can have resentment. Why is that school building, or why is that classroom getting new things and I'm not? By the way, that can lead to a lack of support, even at the school board, right? I want to think about having pilots across my community. But most of all, I can have complete chaos when, if I don't have a pilot so folks understand what's going to happen, all of a sudden I turn things over immediately. Everything is remodeled. How am I supposed to operate inside of this school? And by the way, really good example of that, teachers walked into a new middle school and they literally got rid of the walls. I'm talking about open concept beyond anything. The noise was deafening. Many folks want teacher voice to speak into the design. But if there isn't insight into student engagement, there's actually no connection from the environment to the practice and the outcomes. I need to be thinking about how I'm really effectively engaging my students. And by the way, there can be long-term dissatisfaction because the environment really isn't working. Oftentimes in projects, we want schools to have voice and choice, right? School choice making. But if I don't have teacher and leader training, Teachers come into that new zip code, they're confused. I can have irritated leaders. By the way, very oftentimes after an initial project, it's the building leader that's doing the refresh or repurchasing or adding on. And they're going to spend more money. They don't understand what the vision is because they were never trained. And I can also have safety hazards. I can have things like folks don't understand how to clean the new fancy whiteboard wall. And so all of a sudden in day one, it's used incorrectly and now it's destroyed. So there's a lot of cost involved. And lastly, almost every project has some kind of material specification. But if I'm not thinking about a well-building approach, if I'm not thinking about the actual air, if I'm not thinking about volatile compounds, if I'm not thinking about how I am sanitizing the environment, I actually can increase my materials cost and end up with sick building syndrome. And I'm going to talk about that. So those are the 14 standards that we're going to get at, again, having really studied why projects fail. So I want to build into a problem of practice. What would you write down? If you can chat, what would you chat out? What are the results of a new learning environment? We're going to get a new learning environment. We're getting a new media center. We're getting a new middle school. It's going to look nice. It's going to look new. The colors are going to match my school colors. Everything matches, actually. I'm going to have a sense of pride. But it looks nice and new for how long, right? By the way, if all of a sudden nothing matches in a month or 2 months or a year because I started buying new things that aren't a part of the same set of materials or vision, and the sense of pride can really quickly diminish because all of a sudden you go from a coherent design into incoherence. As a matter of fact, sense of pride and that idea of really effective, nice and new goes away almost immediately if the teachers are confused, if teachers don't like what they're walking into, if some parts of the community feel left out. New environments can actually be lightning rods for community disengagement and strife and conflict. Students can be more difficult to manage. Again, thinking about the stool example, if I am building an environment that doesn't actually reflect the kinds of supports that my students need, I can literally create a disaster. Or as I like to say, I can weaponize the environment. And by the way, my definition of weaponize is a chair with casters that can be flung across the room. And again, that happens sometimes. Time and money are wasted. Interestingly enough, it goes beyond time and money to actual illness. And if you haven't seen the documentary Sick School, I really suggest you look it up. You can watch it for free on YouTube. The World Health Organization estimates that 30% of new and remodel buildings have air quality issues. The National Education Association, in a huge study of schools across the US, found that 1/3 of schools exhibit sick school symptoms. And asthma and other respiratory issues are actually the #1 reason that students are missing from the classroom, that teachers are missing from the classroom. And by the way, sick classrooms can be a singular classroom, or they can be part of a systemic failure. And by the way, everyone can have the slides here. You have a list of all of the things. It's literally any materials that are brought in can have a serious impact, even as much as plants. If you have the wrong plants, and of course you have things like mildew, fungi, you name it, all different kinds of things can lead to a sick classroom or a sick building syndrome. I would also note, as we think about why projects fail and why these standards are important, is that new does not equal high impact, and it certainly does not necessarily equal college or career preparation. What you see here, there's a picture here of Powderhouse High School, where they're building all of their environments to replicate real life work environments, so that when you're in high school, you're literally collaborating as if you were in a workspace in their community. And they went out inside of their community and they looked at those spaces. You have the unique pods, the Google office. Many of the offices in the high-tech community are specifically designed to elicit creativity. And then lastly, you have a picture of a man from White Castle, and you will notice Flippy there. Flippy is a robot. And we know today robots are coming in, and it isn't that they're replacing me, but I have to be able to work with them. So I need to think about my environment, what it looks like for real college and career preparation. I would also note that right now, what we're going through is going to have an impact. It is having an impact on design for schools, new modern learning environments. Every previous big health event has had lasting changes in the built environment. As a matter of fact, as an example, in the Spanish flu epidemic, white wipeable tile became ubiquitous because folks learned about sanitation. And I just saw another one of these that if you've ever seen that, the radiator design that we're often used to, you see it under windows. Radiators were designed the way we know them today because of that same Spanish flu pandemic, because they were designed to heat the room with the window open because they were trying to ventilate the room. And I have a link down here to a really interesting article from Slate on post-pandemic style. The kids that are coming into our buildings are also likely going to be somewhat different. During the second quarter of this year, Realtor.com found that 51% of property searches were from city residents looking to move outside of the city and into more rural environments. Redfin, which is a real estate brokerage firm, reported that users were looking to move to a different metro area, a different location. So a lot of the challenges that we see in urban areas may well be coming to different kinds of areas, suburban areas. And that really leads us to our understanding of our problem of practice. So I suggest that we begin with an articulation like this. This is an example of a goal statement that reflects those 14 standards. Could be a newly built environment, it could be a remodeled environment. High impact learning environment. We are investing for high learning impact, right? Needs to be, first of all, part of a plan for equity across our community. If I'm improving one school and I'm not bringing some of that improvement somehow, in some way, to all of my schools, I have a serious challenge inside of my community. Our environments need to be designed by educators, by health experts and vocational experts, not just an interior designer. The environment needs to align to modern university and workplace environments. If our students are not literally practicing and learning in an environment that is collaborative and informal in the same way that workplaces can be informal, I have a problem. They need to be designed for effective collaborative learning and aligned to the latest healthy environments research. And lastly, I suggest that they have to have a plan from the very beginning for sustained refresh. Otherwise, your design, all of your good thinking and all of your investment will begin to devolve into chaos in day one. So I want to start with this standard of equity, because equity actually doesn't begin with what's inside of the environment. Equity begins with teacher-student interaction. So one of the things that I strongly recommend is that if we are involved in putting together a new environment, let's say in a middle school, that I think about doing some kind of model classroom in my other middle schools as a part of that project. And then bringing my teachers and my leaders together so that everyone is trained in whatever kind of pedagogy, whatever kind of instructional strategy I'm expecting in those new spaces. Now, what have I done? What I've done is I've started to reach out and have an impact in every single classroom at every middle school, because my teachers are learning something new. My teacher-student interaction is improved, even in classrooms where I haven't invested yet in new FF&E, new furnishings, new fixtures. All right. The budget for one model space. And by the way, I'm working right now. I just had a meeting this week on a project where we're actually beginning with the media center as the locus of the change process in the school, and then building out model classrooms around specific kinds of pedagogy. Like, for instance, they're looking at personalized learning. So we're doing a personalized model classroom. They have a STEM initiative. We're doing a STEM model classroom, et cetera. If you go to Media Education's website or to YouTube, there are a variety of videos where real life educators talk about how they actually started planning for equity on the first day. And I noted that Sebastian is a resource for you. One of the things that Meteor does is, at no cost, they will actually come in and help you do an environmental scan so that you have an understanding of where you can prioritize across those other buildings, right? And that's actually a service that they do for free, because they want to begin whatever project it is you're working on with a vision for how we can scale to reach every student. This is actually an example of some of the reports that come out of that. And I can send you, or Sebastian can send you, an example of that report where literally we look at the utility in every building of the different kinds of elements inside of the environment, and look at the classrooms versus the media centers versus the cafeterias to ask, where should I start? What do I need to do to start creating equity across my buildings? Next is a super, super important topic. It's a topic of healthfulness. It's a topic of strategies for disinfection and strategies for sanitation. Now, the reality is that many folks are concerned about this right now because of this little virus called the novel coronavirus. But I want to remind you that this concern about air began, it's been with us for a long time because of so many students and teachers who miss school because of asthma or colds or flu. So almost all of our buildings today in industry have what we call episodic filtration. And I want to suggest to you that we have to begin adopting a new standard in our air, in our environmental sanitization. So episodic filtration is where I bring in air from the outside, and then there's a filter, and it's automatic, it's cleaned at the point of filter. And then the air goes in and it goes across my room. And by the time it gets to the intake, that air is no longer sanitized. It's no longer disinfected. As a matter of fact, if you look at what happened with COVID, the very first study for COVID was in a restaurant, and you had one table right near the place where the air conditioner was, and you had tables all the way down the restaurant to air intake. And of course, the air was blown all across the restaurant, and lots of people got sick. So Meteor is actually the exclusive provider of medical and industry grade air scrubbing that's now available for schools. And it used something called photocatalytic oxidation. Now you can go on, I think next week we're doing a presentation so you can really understand how that works. But essentially, instead of walking into a room and not knowing if the air has been cycled through or receiving air from downwind, the actual molecules are, there's a disinfection strategy to literally sanitize them, every single molecule inside of that room. So it's continuously clean. And this is actually the technology that's used in hospitals, right? It's the same level of hyper cleanliness, strategy for disinfection, very similar to the way hospitals and medical centers disinfect and make sure that there isn't transmission and that allergens and other bacteria in the air are cleaned. By the way, this has been recognized by the EPA as a hyper effective infection control. And it isn't just about viruses, all right, or influenza. The actual Casper unit, that's what it's called, attacks molds and fungi and yeast, and even gets rid of things like those volatile organic compounds and even odors and insects. The approach here is so effective that we know that, for instance, with flu, with H1N1, it went down to literally 0 incidents of flu in the environment. And that disinfection lasted. And that's another thing to think about. So again, I don't want to belabor the point. I just want us to be understanding that as I'm thinking about the environment, I have to have a standard of sanitation, a strategy for disinfection. And today we are being held to a standard that is similar to what medical centers and hospitals need to think about. And that technology is today available. Okay. I noted that new doesn't necessarily mean aligned to the workplaces of today. And I want to give you a real life example of that. This classroom, this is actually a part of a program called Incubator EDU. This classroom was actually designed with the help of executives and businesses from Silicon Valley. And much of what you see inside of this classroom was actually custom made and custom designed to specifically replicate the kinds of environments that students needed to not just sit in, but to collaborate in, to present with each other in, just like they would be working inside of a building in, say, Silicon Valley. So I want you to think about your environmental design standards. And one of the things that Meteor helps us do is actually look at the jobs, the kinds of industries in our communities and how we build to that. An example of that is in California. There's a community where they know that most of their students stay local, and trucking is a really big career. And so putting together a specific learning space that mirrors the kind of learning spaces that kids would be in that particular career. Lastly, I want us to consider that I can create a brand new environment, but if I don't have that link to instruction, I can not only create chaos, I can actually create an environment that is not appropriate for the kind of learning that needs to happen. Meteor has been on the forefront of creating environments, for instance, for students who have autism or are on the spectrum. What you see on your screen right now is called a pro-social classroom. This is a research-based environment where literally the standards for this environment are directly aligned to the learning standards and the social emotional literacy standards put forth by CASEL. And the reason for that is that this is in a leadership academy where almost all of the students were adjudicated, so they'd been in trouble. All of the students were male, and most of the students were poor and from the Latino community or the African American community. It's outside of Dallas. And what happened here is students actually begin working in pairs. And the entire idea is that students every quarter cycle through, and this environment is designed to build their self-confidence. They begin working in pairs as 2, and then they move to small groups for 4. They're presenting to each other, always in their collaboration. They can, if they need to have a little bit of time alone, you see the spaces on the side where they can go and work alone, some solo work, or they need some quiet. But every single quarter, every single student is going to get up on that podium and they're going to give a speech. And this is about building psychological safety and progressive challenge. This is an environment where instructional standards and environmental standards came together to create an amazingly successful experience for those students. So if you and I looked at these classrooms, we might see, like, for instance, on the left, oh, there are some cool looking desks, right? Cloud-shaped desks or whatever. On the right, it might seem more traditional. But there is a designation called ALEP, and that's an Accredited Learning Environment Planner. And you want to make sure that whoever's working with you in your environment actually is accredited, an accredited learning environment planner, because they would look here and they would say, you know what, there's not a lot of flexibility in these spaces, or it's not just flexibility in chairs or desks or how kids are sitting, but how about the flexibility in terms of light? How about the flexibility in terms of height? If you're short, you know what it means to go into a room where things just don't fit right for you, or if you're really tall. Think about a middle school where our students, many of them are growing, they've hit their growth spurt, and others have not. An ALEP expert, Accredited Learning Environment Planner, helps you to look at everything from lighting and furniture to heating to floor to space, all of the elements that you need to think about for those environmental standards. By the way, Meteor has the highest concentration of accredited learning environment planners on their staff. Some of them are former teachers and educators. Others of them actually are experts in furnishings themselves. This is an example of an environment that was designed, obviously elementary classroom, for enormous flexibility here. This environment is like a palette to do lots of different things. And by the way, you'll notice that there are different sized chairs. The desks actually have flexible legs, so the desk can go up and down. But I can literally do any kind of activity here in my curriculum. And I can actually match my curriculum to different centers. So this environment was actually designed in part with a link to a specific vision for curriculum, as was this. This is Atlantic High School in Volusia County, Florida, where they actually looked at the curriculum. They have an understanding of their technology. You see that in the technology bar here. You look at the presentation boards in the back. This environment was designed explicitly thinking about the kind of instruction that needed to happen here and what they wanted to have happen with the students. By the way, you do see some of those funky stools, and those are for kids that need to move around. They have a little extra energy, but you can see in the back there are other kinds of chairs that I might use, a wide variety of choices. As a matter of fact, things like desks and chairs, I might not think about it this way, but they're a critical part of meeting a diverse set of physical needs in the classroom. For instance, I'm sitting on a chair right now that has very little padding, very little cushion. And I've been sitting in it a long time today. And actually you get tired and it becomes harder to focus. Some students with high energy, they actually do better if there are different spaces in the classroom that they can move to throughout the day, or those bouncy kinds of stools or things. Other students don't do well with that. Thinking about higher light or lower light, do I need an independent workspace today or a collaborative workspace? And by the way, not something that just has to be changed around in the classroom, but is there a space in my classroom that I can choose to go sit in and work quietly if that's what I need? These are critical physical needs. We know that effective collaboration is much more than just conversation. It's everything. Actually, again, the Sarasota classroom, this D-shaped desk with that computer there was designed for specific kinds of collaboration with those students. By the way, this was a low-tech implementation. They didn't have a lot of technology, but they had a specific vision of collaboration inside of that classroom. I've been talking about a lot of things that we might see. We might see some of the physical elements in the classroom, chairs and desks. I've been talking about things that we might be able to measure. Like, for instance, I can actually measure the level of different kinds of pollens or allergens, or I could even measure virus in the air. Actually, with that Casper technology, Meteor provides a independent third-party assessment of how well it's cleaned a specific environment. But I want us to think, as we're considering standards, to take high impact environments to scale. What's inside that I can't see with my students? So I want to talk about emotional needs for my students and what I call the wounded learner syndrome. Now, we know that our kids are at the greatest risk. Our youth is at the greatest risk for depression. They're also at the greatest risk for things like sleep disruption, especially our older kids. Actually, young children are at increased for anxiety. And actually high blood pressure, sleep deprivation, substance abuse, self-harm. We could probably spend an hour just thinking about all of the emotional challenges that we're faced with. And oh, by the way, there's of course a little challenge happening right now, which maybe makes us more aware of this because of quarantines and coronavirus. But these things were with us well before, and they will be with us well after. So I can address some barriers, but there are a lot of barriers that are hidden, the unseen, the unheard, what I think of as silent suffering. So we very, very strongly suggest, and again, we have seen environments fail. If I don't have ways, and I'm not actually upfront in my design process, thinking about how am I going to do check-ins with my kids? Is my teacher in the center of the room and they can check in with the students? Are my students going to need that? Or is my teacher removed from this, from the kids? How about the kids in the back of the class? We feel so strongly about this because we've seen environments fail that we went out and we found a technology that actually allows you to measure in real time in about 30 seconds using an emoji-based system how kids are actually doing in terms of their social emotional needs. Everything from how's your social life going today? Is there conflict in it? Are you hungry? How's your body feeling today? Are you having conflict today in your social life? Is there disagreement? How's your energy today? Are you, bouncing off the wall? So we need to do some jumping jacks, and we need to put you on one of those plexi stools, or you're completely exhausted. And I need to make sure that you are in a collaborative environment. This software is called Rhythm. We actually have a special relationship with the folks who make it. So we can, it's not free, but we can do it very inexpensively. But most importantly, my message to you is when you think about what you're doing in your new environment, ask yourself, how are we seeing into and addressing students' social emotional needs in that environment? Are we literally designing our environment to be aligned to CASEL social emotional literacy standards. And this is an example in the middle of some of the reporting that comes out of that software that literally not lets you see into the child, but you'll know, should the child be in a collaborative environment? Do you need to check in with the child one-on-one? Do they need more teacher attention today? Do you need to have them doing jumping jacks because they need to release a little bit of energy? Or do I have students who need to be in that more independent, quiet type setting? When you bring all of that together, you're thinking about equity, you're thinking about model classrooms, you're thinking about making sure that my teacher can check in, you're thinking about lots of different kinds of spaces. I want you to consider that collaboration is successful by design. What you see on your screen is a image from a research study. It was done at the University of Minnesota, where the teacher station, where the professor station was put in the middle of the classroom. And what happened was they found that the professor was better able to monitor, to reassure students, to redirect them, to listen, to intervene and coach. But what happens if you take a teacher and you put them in the middle of a classroom and you say, this is where your teacher station is going to be. And oh, by the way, a bunch of your students are going to have their back to you. Not all of our teachers are going to be able to just pivot and understand how to teach effectively in that environment. And that's why we have to make sure that we are orienting our teachers, we're training our teachers and our leaders into the design vision for what it is we are doing inside of that environment. If I gave you this environment, would you understand, first of all, what to do in it, how it was designed to get the students up to the podium? By the way, you'll notice here, there was actually no teacher desk. This particular environment is designed so that the teacher is constantly rotating amongst the groups, and the teacher actually has a little stool on casters and a teacher desk that rolls around and is powered up so that they can have their laptop on it. As you think about how you put these ideas together, I want to make sure that you know that there is assistance. So I might ask you the question, are your learning environment and curriculum standards, are those standards aligned? One of the things that we do is we bring to bear experts from the nonprofit Center for College and Career Readiness, folks who work with USC, the University of Southern California. And we actually can look at your curriculum materials, your textbooks, your lesson design, and we can look and ask, what kind of interaction do you expect between your teachers and your kids? And what kind of environment should I be creating? Or if you've already created a high impact learning environment, are these materials still aligned to do that? And you know what I'm saying here. You know that many of the lessons that we have are really lessons where someone is just saying and spraying, right? They're sitting at the front of the classroom and you're going to get whatever they're going to give you. What happens when I create a collaborative environment? If I haven't actually impacted my lesson design and my teacher training, all that's going to happen is that collaborative environment is going to become sit and get again, right? It's just that my kids are at a cloud-shaped desk. This is an example of that sample environmental scan report, where if you're thinking about equity and you're thinking about scaling to standards, you need to begin by understanding your current state assessment. And again, Meteor is kind enough to do a current state assessment at no cost. So I hope I've given you some ideas about how we can approach a high impact learning environment, not with just 7 standards, things like price as part of the criteria, but making sure that we begin on the first day of our conversation, thinking about equity across our community, as we bring design meld together, our educators, our health experts, our vocational experts with, yes, an interior designer, making sure that we are aligned to modern university and workplace environments. We need to make sure that we're designed for effective collaborative learning. And I've given you a number of examples of what that can look like and how we need to think about the actual students there, right? What their actual needs are and the teachers that are working in that environment. We have to align to the latest healthy environments research, especially today. I believe that our communities expect us to bring a much higher level of healthfulness to our buildings and a plan for sustaining that, sustaining that design vision. So a month from now, a year from now, the design vision remains in place. We have a white paper on these criteria. We actually have a rubric. And if you'd like to connect with Sebastian S. Sanchez at meteoreducation.com or myself, we can set up a classroom analysis to start that current state assessment. And if you're interested in thinking about what curriculum might look like or should look like, depending upon your environment, we're happy to do that as well. I hope I've given you some food for thought as we think about modern learning environments and how we create standards for scale.